as you took that picture,
What
this
happened?
went off, which is alarming.
It wants to connect to my Bluetooth. Well,
It's okay, it's on.
anyway, good morning, guys.
Good morning, everybody.
It's Sunday morning, and yes, that is not the pool. That
Too cold.
is inside. Too cold outside, and to be honest, not feeling so great. So trying to just stay indoor a little bit.
Francis had a serious bout of man flu.
I wouldn't call it.
Well, you're a man
flu.
and you had flu.
It's a bit of a cough, I would say.
No, only
it's not flu.
Always
flu,
underplay your
you need
sickness.
fever. Am I right? You need fever for flu, right? That's not. I didn't have fever.
No, we didn't have flu. We didn't take a rest.
Anyway, this is just a proof of us having a very busy week, living a
Have
little
we met?
bit past each other this week. We missed about 2 date nights this week. So we're having to catch up tomorrow. Tomorrow is our anniversary. 20 minus 1, 19 years married. So yeah, it's been a long time. Morning, Alta. It's been good, right?
So good.
So good.
So hard and so good.
So hard and so good marriage. Worth it.
Totally.
Yeah,
I've been with you for more than half my life.
I would do it again.
No, you would.
Yeah, I will. Yeah, for sure. For sure. I know.
Anyway, I know you like me.
Yeah, you know. I hope you've had a good week and you're having a little bit of a relaxed Sunday morning. Yeah. You may just take a sip of my tea.
Yeah, you go. I'll watch. It's good.
My wife says I can't drink softly. I'm always slurping to some degree. Anyway, that's that. Guys, we are ending Galatians today. Just don't be too excited. It was a great time in Galatians, and I'm sad to leave it. And really excited to just walk through some of the main threads that we find in the book of Galatians. See this rattling a bit, so we're going to have to sit still. Anyway, so Galatians, the first thing, there's 5 or 6 things that I want to focus on today, which are basically they are summaries of what we've done, but I want to kind of put them together. The 5 or 6, I think it's 5 of them, main themes, 6, 5, main themes of the book of Galatians. So the first thing that I want to elaborate slightly on is the idea, and you would have heard me speak about early Paul. It's just not something I grew up speaking about. It's most definitely not something I've ever preached on. Nobody would have heard the words early Paul from me during the last many years of my life. But early Paul is just simply the idea that some of the books that we attribute in our Bibles to Paul are early and some are very late. So you have the first, there's 13 books we traditionally attribute to Paul in the New Testament. That's a lot of books, right? So Paul is really a shaper of our theology. But a lot of knowledge has come to light. A lot of scholarship's been done on Paul because he's such an influential figure in world history, really, and especially Western history. So the reality is that at this point, most of the scholarly consensus is that there are 7 books that they believe were written by Paul. They all sit early in the timeline, more or less between 50 and 60 AD, right? And then there's another group of books that we have in our New Testament. There's 6 of them, and they sit chronologically quite a bit later. They sit between 90 and 100 AD. Now that's quite a big gap, but there's one extra little thing. Paul dies in around 65. Right. So these books are not attributed by the scholars to Paul, but to someone who wrote in Paul's name, possibly a disciple of Paul, someone who follows after him, who wants these traditions to continue and develop from the early writings of Paul. And I think this is why, and I'm not sure if you've ever noticed, but if you've read the New Testament, especially Paul's works, quite attentively, you'll find that ideas change over time. And we really have these two pockets, kind of. We have the 50s to 60s, 90s to 100s, very rough times, but in which ideas are different. Some of the books have been not attributed to Paul, basically just because of the way they were written, the writing style. To any logical person, linguistically, it just doesn't fit Paul. Others have been separated from the early Paul based on other factors, like the theology changing and shifting over time. Now, this is something we have to keep in mind, and this is the reason why we want to read early Paul almost together. And so as a beginning or an introduction to early Paul, we tackled Galatians. Now, there are two of the early Paul books which are, as we understand, the earliest. Galatians and 1 Thessalonians. Thessalonians. Sorry, I've got the Afrikaans mixed in there. Those are the two earliest as far as we understand. And then following on them is Philemon, some say Philemon, Philemon, then Philippians, 1 and 2 Corinthians, and then Romans. Those are the first 6 which are classified as the early Paul books, of which the most early ones are Galatians and 1 Thessalonians. We started in Galatians, but we're going to go on to Thessalonians probably next week, or the next time we do this run, so that we put together, slowly start putting a better picture together of early Paul, because the reality is early Paul shapes us.
And is it important to know this? Because if you think that all the books were written by his hand around the same time, there's contradictions or ideas that seem to contradict each other, and then it forces you to interpret it for it to make sense.
And that's a mess. Once you have to interpret the two opposite things,
to interpret contradictions to make them mean the same thing,
then they become meaningless. And that's what we normally do as Christians, especially if we have the idea that no, the whole Bible says exactly the same thing. That's a problem. So we have to remember the context of these books. Remember there were people who wrote them under inspiration, yes, but these were people in context. And just as today our theology slowly changed, and your theology in your life might have shifted over time, so in the same way, these writers, they didn't know they were writing the Bible. They didn't know their text would have been included in the canon of Scripture, which we created, but really
and taken as gospel truth.
Yeah. Paul wrote to churches. This is a letter to a church, which we took and said, this fits in with what we believe the church did, and say we're going to canonize this, meaning we're making this the plumb line for all writings. But in truth, Paul had no idea that he was busy writing a Bible that would exist 2,000 years later. So this is the reason why we spend so much time in Galatians and why we use the term early Paul. Simply because we want to try and isolate early Paul from late Paul.
Yeah.
If we can say, if that is even Paul, I'll call it late Paul for those who want. We need to separate them so we can see what changes. And this is the interesting thing, that when you do the separation, you do see quite a significant change in certain theological things. So that is the distinction between early and late Paul. And I think it's incredibly important for any person that's taking the Bible seriously and is taking the context of the Bible seriously and not just reading it shallowly as if everyone said exactly the same thing just from a different angle. That's an assumption we made later on, and that assumption kind of built the theology we have today. But if we come to it more humbly, not assuming the Bible is something that works exactly like this, but we take it on face value to a degree. In face value, I mean taking the context into account, taking into account who Paul was.
Acknowledging the reality of
what was Paul's reality before he converted to Christianity? What was his mindset? And this brings me to the next point. And this is probably the most important point that needs to be understood when we're reading early Paul. And this is that old word, apocalyptic. And you would have heard me use it many times during some of these sessions. And I feel like I'm repeating myself sometimes with it. But to be honest, it took me almost 2 years to get my head around what was actually going on. And so I'm going to be slightly presumptuous and just open it up a little bit more so that people can get their heads around what this actually means. Because it is, if Galatians or even early Paul, and you can include Jesus in this, if it is a painting, the apocalyptic viewpoint, the apocalyptic expectation of the Jewish people, specifically the Pharisees, is the canvas. Everything is painted on the backdrop of this apocalyptic expectation. So I want to spend a couple of moments. A simple term to replace apocalyptic would just simply be an imminent expectation of the end of the world the way it is right now. And so in the 3rd to 2nd century BC, the Jews started understanding the world as one that is, yes, under the control of God, but there are these evil forces that actually run the world. These evil forces, demons, under the leadership of Satan, and later on we called him Lucifer. But they actually run the world. But their time is limited, and basically the apocalyptic expectation is always like this: their time is up. It's any moment now, like next Tuesday. God is going to deal a final blow to these powers, and God's going to set up something that he actually intended from the beginning. It's going to be beautiful, and we'll speak about that in a moment. So this is when we pick up on these things in the book of Galatians, but it is important to understand that the Pharisees of this time, this was their worldview. It looks very much different to the Torah and what's found in the Torah. Torah doesn't highlight any of that. I don't want to speak too much about that today.
So
but
where is their view found?
The view found in some of the non-canonical Jewish writings, like the first book of Enoch or the book of Jubilees from the 3rd to 2nd century BC, where those books were written. And in our scriptures, a reflection of that is found in the book of Daniel.
Okay.
Right, so these are the books that seems to start to reflect a view for the Jewish people that, yes, God is in control, but at the moment, there are these evil forces that are running havoc on the earth. They are the ones responsible for all sin, suffering, death, etc., etc. But their time is up, and God's going to deal them a final blow. And in this final blow, from the book of Enoch and I think from the book of Daniel, we get this figure called the Son of Man, which is this figure that comes to enact this victory or this massive war between good and evil, and then wins. And so once he wins, God sets up on the earth a beautiful, blissful kingdom in which there's no more pain and no more suffering, in which people live forever. There's this expectation that this can happen at any moment. And so we see the book of Daniel reflecting this. And we also see that in the books of Enoch and Jubilees, which I can't say too much about today. The point is that the Pharisees were the champions of this view. And this is where Paul was raised in. This is what he was raised in. So Paul would have grown up as now that Paul would have grown up as a young Jewish boy from the tribe of Benjamin, the Pharisee, expecting God to soon make an end to the evil system, cosmos, of this world, and to set up his kingdom. Okay. And Paul then, once he had an experience with Jesus, which he mentions in the book of Galatians, he believed that Jesus was this figure that was coming again, right, to come and do this. And so there are a couple of things that the apocalyptic expectation had, the consequences of it. And I just want to touch on some of the notes I made early this morning. Number one, in this expectation, God is going to free the world from the evil by freeing it from these evil powers, right? What also happens at this time is a raising of the dead. And so what would happen is everybody that had died up until this point will experience a resurrection. The good people or God's people, whichever way you want to run that, they will then become partners, shareholders, and become part of this new kingdom on earth that they will enjoy blissfully, etc. But those who were bad people or those who were not God's people, when they are resurrected, they will be judged and they will be destroyed. Right? the apocalyptic view is not necessarily one that focuses on a punishment forever, but it does focus, it seems, like a destruction forever, like an annihilation, no longer existing.
Okay.
And then on earth, you will have this amazing kingdom where only God rules and all the people are happy without pain and suffering, etc., etc. So this is in just. That's kind of what it says. And so for Paul, saying that Jesus was risen from the dead was the proof that this will happen. Jesus is this first one that comes rising from the dead. And so this is the proof that God will raise the dead. Right? And this was an important contention for the Jews of the first century, because the Sadducees, you would have heard of, they did not believe in the raising of the dead. They were more inclined to believe what the Torah taught, which is not apocalypticism. But it was important for Paul to make the point that if Jesus was raised from the dead, it's the proof that humans will also be raised from the dead.
Really?
Those who are God's are going to come up and they're going to enjoy this beautiful life, etc. Right? So what we see in the book of Galatians is that we see Paul speaking about the faithfulness of Jesus. And it's because of the faithfulness of Jesus that God would usher in this righteousness or this justice or this justification. The word justification and the word righteousness is basically the same word, just in a different form. It means the same thing. It's not two separate things, really. So it seems like from the book of Galatians, at least, that Paul sees Jesus as this figure that comes because of his death and his resurrection. It does two things. It is the kind of like the way we get out of this system. And when Jesus then comes again, he comes as a conquering warrior, I guess, coming to deal a final blow to the evil powers, deal with the rulers. At this point, they would have believed that people reigning on earth, the actual rulers, possibly the Roman government of the time, is basically just a puppet of the evil powers. And to some extent, God would deal with that. I'm not sure exactly how they would interpret that. But the point is simply that it was the faithfulness of Jesus, the fact that he was willing to die, that is going to rescue us, and he will come again and he will do this, right? And so Paul introduces three ideas here that I believe is exactly the same thing in the book of Galatians. The first one is the kingdom of God. First it appears as the inheritance, and then it appears in another form, the kingdom of God. And finally, we find it in chapter 6. It is called the new creation. And so maybe for the first time, when I realized what the new creation actually means to Paul.
Him.
Yeah, it means that God makes this world new by dealing those evil powers a final blow, and he makes all things new, not all new things. So God sets up something beautiful on it, and that's the new creation. I don't think Paul had in mind the destruction of the earth as a planet and a new one forming. It was really getting rid of the system that runs the world, the elements, the principles of the world, and setting up his own system, kingdom. So these three, I think, is referring more or less to the same thing in the book of Galatians: the inheritance, the kingdom, and the new creation. Okay. If you go to the book of Thessalonians, which is something we'll do very soon, which is the other of the two earliest books, right? There he deals in quite a bit of detail with what will actually happen when Jesus comes. Right? He goes in quite a lot of detail, like what will it be like? And then it becomes quite clear that Paul did not write this for 2013. Paul wrote this for his time. Paul was convinced, and I believe that Jesus was also convinced that it was for their time. This event would happen in their time. All right, great. So the apocalyptic expectation.
Paul believed when Jesus came, when he comes back.
Yes. He believed that Jesus would come back any moment. Right. At least in his lifetime, because he refers to we who remain. But we'll deal with that in Thessalonians. The point is just that he was expectant of this in his own time, and we see that from his writing. Okay. So this is the canvas. This apocalyptic expectation is really the canvas upon which everything is painted. The center figure of the painting, of course, is Jesus. As Paul sees Jesus He calls him in the book of Galatians, he calls him Lord, he calls him Messiah, and he calls him Son of God. Those are the three terms he gives him in the book of Galatians. It is quite different from calling someone God. I know for Christians, when we say Son of God and God, to us it's the same thing because of our theology. But the reality is, in this era, in the first century, the idea of Son of God was quite something different.
Okay.
It did not mean that you are God. Did not necessarily mean that you are God. And I think that's quite easy to show from the first century. But anyway, that's besides the point here. So the next thing that Paul introduces is the idea of the faith. And we spent a lot of time on that. But the faith is introduced to us in the book of Galatians simply as the faithfulness of Jesus. In other words, the faith of Jesus, the trustworthiness of what he came to do. And Paul encourages us to rely on the faithfulness of Jesus, or to trust in the faithfulness of Jesus, or the trust in the trustworthiness is actually a better translation of Jesus. And I think that what he is referring to here is actually the life and the death of Jesus, that if he's willing to do this for us, we can trust him that when he comes, he will sort things out. So Galatians is not really promoting the idea of to belong to God, you have to believe these 7 things, or you have to believe in a Trinity, or you have to believe in a rapture, or you have to believe in the Apostles' Creed, which didn't exist by this time. It really is just Paul saying, trust Jesus. It's the simplicity of it, that because of his love for us, we can trust him that he will complete the job. He will bring the kingdom, he'll bring the inheritance, he will usher in a new creation. So for me, this is actually quite an important point, because the reality is that the book of Galatians, Thessalonians, and actually all the early writings of Paul are most probably written before the Gospels. That's something to consider. And that's why, to me, it has so much weight and so much meaning. Some scholars would even argue that the earliest Gospel, which they believe to be Mark, was influenced by the writings of Paul.
Oh.
Because it is at least 10 to 20 years after Paul. So that's something to consider, that actually what we might be dealing with in Galatians is the first actual theorized version, the first theology about what Jesus
the purpose
is.
of the point of
Absolutely.
Jesus. Wow.
Absolutely. So that's quite something to consider. That's why I took the time to spend a bit of time here.
Do you need water? You okay?
Oh, I'm okay. I've got this tea. Okay, so it's the relying on the faithfulness of Jesus. He makes the point that the just shall live by faith. And then early on, he clarified that by saying the just shall live by the faith of the Son of God. In other words, in other words, the point here is just once again that even our lives and the way we live it is not based on how great our belief is, but is actually based on how great the trustworthiness of Jesus is. So that's an important distinction from what you would normally find in church. And what we grew up believing, that it's all about us believing the right things, where it seems like an early Paul, it's all about us relying on the work of Jesus. That's pretty huge, I think, and that needs a little bit of extra thought. Paul then mentions also in Galatians a false faith. What is that? Well, the false faith to Paul seems to be the type of faith that does not rely on the faithfulness of Jesus, but relies on its own ability to fulfill requirements, of which he uses the circumcision as like a focus point. Under the law, under the Torah, this was the main thing. It was the way you got into the covenant of the Torah. And Paul is saying we don't need it. It's not important anymore. What is important is the faithfulness of Jesus. And that's a huge mindset shift, I think, for the people of the time. But I think it's still a huge mindset shift for Christians of today. And then Paul introduces this idea of a new life by the Spirit, and a life that is now separate from the law, or no longer under the law. When we say law, we also mentioned that it's not referring to the 10 commandments. It's not referring to the 600 and whatnot Levitical laws. The word here would have been, the Greek is nomos, but the Hebrew would have been Torah. And we're talking about the first 5 books of the Bible. We're talking about the books, the law of Moses, which is 5 books that sets out the journey, sets out the Genesis account, Abraham, and then flows into Moses and the account of the Israelites journeying from Sinai through and into the Promised Land. And Paul is saying God wants to redeem us out from under that, which is kind of weird because it seems just simply that Paul's moving on from the Torah. Of course, in Christian doctrine, we don't believe in that. We believe that the Torah is still binding on us. It should tell us how to live. It should tell us what to do. And most importantly, and unfortunately most disturbingly, is we believe it should tell us what God is like. And I think that's a bit of it's an issue for me for sure. I think when I see Paul here asking people to move on and move out from under and be redeemed from under and move on, I can fully see why he would say that. And so Paul introduces in chapter 4, 5, and finally in 6, a new type of struggle. In the beginning, it seems like the struggle is between the law, this external set, books, construction, covenant, that bears upon the human flesh. And he makes mention that the human flesh is incapable of keeping it and can never be justified. Now, we have to keep in mind that when we use justified, now we have to think beyond just us having a nice standing before God. We're actually talking about entering this new world where righteousness dwells. So we've got to just keep that in mind when we're talking about justification. And so in that light, he's saying the law just can't get into this world. It's going to be a world of the Spirit. It's going to be a world where the Spirit's wishes are observed. And it's not going to be something coming from the outside. It's going to be something from the inside, right? Okay. The next thread here is the way in which, interesting to me, the way in which Paul views the Jewish religion. And he also calls it that. He calls it that twice early on in the book. He calls it the Jewish religion.
As if he's outside of it,
It's weird to me. He shouldn't be saying that. If he was still a law-abiding citizen, Torah-abiding citizen, he wouldn't have called it that. It seems like he's distancing himself. And then when you read further on in the book of Galatians, Paul uses swear words to describe it. And the overall feel from the book of Galatians is simply that Paul feels we need to move on from the law. He is not friendly towards the Torah. He uses it to tell us we need to move on from it. Right? That's the genius of Paul, I guess, is that that's exactly what he does in here. So Paul will relate to and call the law indirectly or directly a place of bondage, place of curse, even. He calls it a tradition. He says that the law was given to Moses by angels, which is something that's not even found in the Torah. It feels like a downgrade from the idea that we really found in the Torah, that God gave the law to Moses. But here is a little clue for us, because the idea that the law was given by angels to Paul actually comes from the Apocalyptic time, the 2nd century BC, from the book of Jubilees. We have mention of this for the first time, as far as I know, which gives us an idea where Paul gets his stuff, where it shows us that he has a reference point that sits outside of the Torah, outside of our Bible, the book of Jubilees, which is now, it's not considered scripture by us or by the Jews, but it was highly influential in the time in which the Jews started thinking apocalyptically. There's another example which I always use because I think it's incredibly interesting, that the portion in him we live, move, and have our being, which is, I think, written by Paul, is a poem to Zeus. And it tells us that Paul wasn't afraid to use things that were outside the Torah in his writing. I hadn't heard that before. Yes. So that's interesting because we need to see Paul for who he was.
That song is now kind of haunting.
Well, it doesn't really matter, actually. But it is important to know that Paul drew from sources outside of what we today would consider the Bible. Right?
But it's brave just to even go there and think that, and even braver to say it, because it feels like potentially you going outside of the Bible.
You have to.
Is so important. Is so crucial to understanding the Bible itself. But how can you understand something if you're only on that thing?
Well, the point is that the reality is that the Bible has roots outside the Bible.
Yes.
And that's why you have to
look outside.
We have to look outside the Bible to understand the Bible. So I think that's the important point.
But how did it become so that anything outside the Bible, you are like betraying your faith?
Well, I mean, this is a different discussion, but just briefly, I would say that the Reformation kind of pushed that idea, sola scriptura. They were hammered by so many things that went wrong in the church, where authority was the most important thing, and they needed something to anchor their faith in, and they chose the Bible. And from there on, it kind of spiraled into nothing but the Bible, not science, not history, not archaeology, nothing.
Look outside the window.
So we grew up in the era of nothing but the Bible, but the reality is the Bible has its own roots.
And we grew up in an era that's just a speck in history as well.
So the moment you start researching and reading, you realize the Bible actually has its roots outside of itself. And to understand that means the Bible has context. Like if you then read it outside of context, you cannot understand it. Well, then you can do with it whatever you want.
Exactly.
Okay. All right. So Paul is not very favorable towards the Jewish religion. He calls it temporary. He says those in it can't inherit. So he's actually saying that if you stay under it, you can't enter this new blissful world. Like that's kind of what he is saying. He's saying that it persecutes those who do. And he connects it to the elements of this world, which is a very interesting and a harsh statement, but kind of makes sense to me by now. So Paul uses the law, as we've said earlier. He uses the law to tell us that we need to move on from it. Like it is quite interesting how he uses two examples from the law. In fact, he starts just before chapter 4, is at the beginning of chapter 4. He says, "Those of you who want to be under the law, don't you hear the law?" And then he starts quoting story, or not quoting, but referencing Abraham, and how there's two accounts. The first one, which is not that one, the first one, he uses Abraham to show that God promised Abraham that all the nations of the world will be blessed through Abraham's faithfulness, and he uses this as an allegory for the gospel he now preaches, the good news, which is Jesus' faithfulness brings a blessing to many, right? To all, some say. Okay. The other one is, of course, the example of Isaac and Ishmael, which he flips 100%, 180 degrees on its head, and he makes current Israel, the Jewish religion, he makes it Ishmael, which is a son of bondage by the bondwoman. And he makes the church, with the thing which he's now part of, Isaac, the son of promise. And then he gets to the end and he says, look, Ishmael can't inherit, throw her out. What happened to Ishmael? He says Ishmael got thrown out. And so it seems like Paul is not very friendly towards the Jewish ways from here on, or at least the understanding of being under the Jewish Torah or whatever. But he uses cleverly, and he does this right throughout all his writings, he uses the scripture. He uses the Torah, the law, to show us that we don't need it anymore, that we need to move on from it. Which I think is exactly what a Pharisee would do, who spent his whole life. And he would have come to the conclusion that if the Torah was given by God, and that Jesus is now representing God, and God for some, it would make sense that the Torah already had those seminal thoughts inside of it, that we'd have to move on from it at some point. Like a contract that in itself has a termination clause. Something like that. Okay, so that was number 4 that we find through the book of Galatians. Quite striking that Paul's not very friendly towards the law of Moses, and is basically urging people to move on and saying circumcision doesn't matter anymore, which is huge. It's contradictory to some sense to the law of Moses. And how do we do, what do we do with that today? Well, the point is that the guy we look up to, Paul, did it 2,000 years ago already. And then for me, the most important, number 5, is the final thread that we find through the book of Galatians, the final and most important one is there is a clear transition to love in the book of Galatians. And the last and final chapter is about the practice of love in a community, carrying one another's burdens, not judging others, but helping them, and so on. To me, this is the most important one, because if we assume that Paul is expecting this new world any moment, like next month or next Tuesday, he is setting us up for what this world will be like, what will be in it, how it will be, and that we now should endeavor to live by the Spirit that will fill that world. And it seems from the book of Galatians that this Spirit that Paul speaks about is the Spirit of God, but it's the Spirit of love. And so in chapter 5 and in chapter 6, Paul lands everything in the practice of love. Paul does not land Galatians in what to believe, but Paul lands Galatians in what to do. Very much like Jesus would have done in the Beatitudes, not what to believe, but what to do. So early Paul, it seems that there's not yet any indication of these are the things that we have to believe and then everything will be fine. It's more like, let's live now the way the world will be when God is done with it, right?
Okay.
In my mind, Paul's apocalyptic expectation never really happened in his lifetime, as he said. In my mind, this probably will look completely different to what Paul had in mind, but we need to understand why he thought the way he thought. Okay, so there's a transition from the Torah and all these requirements to the grace gift of righteousness that comes through the faithfulness of Jesus, right? There is these two little portions that work together, and they work together like this. Paul starts both of them in the same way by saying neither circumcision nor uncircumcision avails anything. That's King James for has any power, or has any influence, or matters. And then in these two portions, the first one, he says, the only thing that matters, the only thing that has force now is faith that works through love. And so he puts love as the landing place, and faith being the way we get to that love. And we mentioned this refers to us. Our faith brings us to the point of love, but I think it also very clearly speaks of Jesus, that his faithfulness produced and showed his love. And Paul is always calling us into the same type of love. But what is interesting, the second time he says, neither circumcision nor uncircumcision avails anything, he says, the only thing that avails or matters is the new creation. So for me, that is a tie together. That's a deliberate writing to tie for us the idea that the new creation is a place of love. And of all the things he could have chosen, this is the one he puts in front. I mean, Paul doesn't even here say it's a place of immortality. He doesn't say it's a place without pain, although he might have believed those things. A place without suffering. The one that needs to be said, the only one that he highlights in Galatians is this place will be a place of love. In other words, God's going to do something. Whatever God's going to do, it ends in a place of love. Right. And so then in chapter 5, he has this battle between the flesh and the spirit. So no longer law and flesh, but now flesh and spirit. Flesh, for me, is simply just this inclination inside me and you to be selfish, to do what we want to do, and to the detriment of other people. It's an instinct of self-preservation. And now, standing as a stark contrast to this, he puts the spirit of love, the spirit of selflessness, or the spirit of now doing for others as you want done for yourself. And he goes as far as to say that the law is filled in this, that we love one another as we love ourselves, which is a huge statement. Paul doesn't stop by just putting spirit there, but he actually describes the spirit. If the spirit, what does the spirit of God look like if you could see it, if you could feel it, if it could be demonstrated to you? What does it look like? What does it feel like? And in my mind, Paul has this expectation that the Spirit would really actually fill the world to come. The age to come is another term we could use for that. So if you want to know what tree it is, you look at the fruit. And so Paul uses that allegory to tell us what the Spirit looks like. And then that's where we get the idea, or the portion about the fruit of the Spirit. What does the fruit of the Spirit look like? Of course, the first one is love. And all of the others that follow could be understood as a subsection of love. And, you can read them. They love, kindness, joy, peace, long-suffering, means patience with people, goodness, faithfulness, gentleness, meekness, self-control, etc., etc. This is the Spirit that now is not on the outside, but is actually on our inside. And now that is at odds with our natural biological wiring. So for Paul, he's always speaking about God doing something in him, Christ in us. And I think what he's referring to is God busy pushing his Spirit from the inside of humanity to come in opposition to our flesh.
Yeah.
I think Paul expects the Spirit to win in the end, and to somehow for it to fill everything. And so he encourages people in chapter 5 to now walk in the Spirit. And then he explains it. He says, carry one another's burdens. Carry one another's weaknesses. I think that is not really, what is meant by that is not pointed out and then judge people and condemn them and cut them off. I don't think that's what's meant here. Carry another's weakness is to come alongside. Then he carries on, and one of the things he lays out in chapter 5 is this idea of whatever you sow in this life, you'll reap. You can choose to live your life by the flesh, meaning do exactly what you feel all the time, no matter what the consequences for anyone. But there is also consequences for you. You'll reap what you sow is the allegory. So the opposite of that is if you live a life that is in the Spirit or by the Spirit, by this we mean nothing spooky. By this is meant nothing almost, can I say, supernatural in context of church.
Invisible.
Yeah, by this is meant simply bearing the fruit of the Spirit. And so he says, when you if there is someone that's struggling, let those who are spiritual. What does he mean by that? He says, those who have the fruit of the Spirit. We don't care if you speak in tongues. We don't care if you can lay out prophecies. We don't care if you can interpret dreams and have dreams and visitations every night. It's not that important. What's more important and what really qualifies us as spiritual is, can we operate in love? Ultimately, that seems to be the landing place. And that all of this to the Galatians, starting with, you guys are going backwards. He calls them foolish Galatians. All of this lands in, can you practice love? What we need to do now is we need to practice love. What you sow, you reap. So I want to end off. Those are the 5, but I want to end off by just pointing out what's not in Galatians.
Okay.
And some of the ideas we don't really find in early Paul that are now very much part of Christianity. So I'm just going to throw these out. These are controversial, so you might want to put a seatbelt on there. But anyway, here we go. Paul does not promote the idea of dying, and then living in heaven forever. That's not Paul's viewpoint. That's not the apocalyptic expectation. It's not a die, your body stays here, your spirit goes and be with God forever, and you are just in heaven and having a lacquer time. That's not what's going on here. I think the Jewish apocalypticism is this: you die, you're dead, right? Then you'll be resurrected and live with God, with Jesus in this new kingdom here on earth. I think that's what's going on. The idea that we die and go to heaven seems to have slightly other origins, mostly Greek. Also, then the opposite of this is this idea that when you die and you've been a bad person, you go to hell because you didn't accept Jesus. This is not in Galatians. At best, we can say that, Paul doesn't really address it in Galatians. But from a Jewish apocalyptic view, the stance would most probably have been, the traditional one at least, that if you've been a really bad person and you hate God and you're not God, when Jesus does come, the resurrection takes place, you are resurrected, and then you are destroyed forever and annihilated. Right? There's really hardly any mention of punishment in Jewish apocalypticism. Right? Later on, late Paul, and I can almost say late Gospels as well, we find different type of things. We find the punishment creeping in and so on. All right, so I'm just talking about Galatians. Those things are absent in Galatians.
You're running out of time.
Okay, running out of time. I
Slow
am out of
down.
time. Okay. In Galatians, there's no requirement to ascend to a specific set of doctrines to get into heaven or go to hell. It's just not there. Faith is not a set of requirements. In fact, it is the opposite. It is just a reliance on the faithfulness of Jesus. Those are the only ones I want to mention here.
So those things that we hold on to,
these are things traditionally. These are things Christians would hold to that are not really found in early Paul. And I'm going to say one more thing: early Jesus. They're not found in the early versions. They're found in later versions, later Gospels, later epistles. That's an important point.
So what do we do with that?
No, I leave you there.
You leave us there. Wow.
I leave you there. Anyway, that's Galatians. So that's been really interesting for me. But next week we're going to go to its twin Thessalonians. Okay. And I think it's going to be interesting. All right, time's up.
Time is up,
Have a good week. See you guys next week.
See you next time.